Good afternoon, and welcome to Identifying and Mitigating Key Drivers of Insider Risk, a health system CIO production sponsored by Protenus. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. My name is Anthony Guerra. I'm the founder and editor-in-chief of Health System CIO, and I'll be your moderator today. We're looking forward to your participation. You can send in your questions or comments anytime in the Q&A box, and we'll take them later in the program. Just so you see how we're going to spend our time today, first, we're going to go about 35 to 40 minutes with our main panel discussion featuring Brian Kayers, CISO at Keck Medicine of USC, Nicole Brown, former Director of Compliance and Integrity of the Privacy Program with the Ann and Robert H. Lurie Children's Hospital of Chicago, and Nicole has a new role now, which she will let us know about in a minute, and Nick Culbertson, co-founder and CEO at Protenus. And then we will have our audience Q&A. So let's jump right in. If you want to give us an overview of your organization and your role. And Nicole, because of the news, I'm going to start with you.
Thanks, Anthony. So I'm happy to share that I have recently joined City of Hope's privacy program, and I will be overseeing implementation of their auditing and monitoring program, including their staff education. So really excited about this new role.
Excellent. Thank you, Nicole. Brian?
Hello, Brian Kerr, the Chief Information Security Officer for Keck Medicine of USC. So Keck Medicine is a health system, multiple hospitals in the LA area, and we are also part of universities owned by the University of Southern California. So we also have the academic side of that and the medical system as well.
Very good, Brian. Thank you. Nick?
Hey everyone, Nick Culbertson, CEO of Protenus, one of the co-founders as well. We use AI and automation to help hospital systems reduce risk. Specifically relevant to this conversation, our AI monitors employee behaviors in various types of PHI to ensure that all access is part of treatment and payment operations, and otherwise weeding out as a last layer of defense when employees could be potentially accessing PHI outside of their job role or posing as an insider threat. We also detect other types of risk as well, including when employees are stealing narcotics or clinical drug diversion.
All right. Very good. Thank you, Nick. Let's jump right in. I guess definitions can be important, and this one can probably take on a couple different forms. So let's talk about the definition of insider risk and see if it can be fuzzy with some people, including some things and leaving other things out. So, Brian, let's start with you.
So ultimately, I look at the definition of insider risk as somebody with access to the internal systems. I used to do a lot of program development and for helping organizations actually build insider risk programs. And the way I looked at it is kind of broke up into four areas. When I look in, misuse and error, fraud, intellectual property theft, and then potential IT sabotage. So when I look at those, we always kind of focus on what are those areas, right? So when we look at misuse and error, obviously is the largest risk that we see typically from those 50% of all those issues around that. So when, an insider could be just a misinformed employee, right? That doesn't understand the policy procedures, potentially not trying to be malicious, just doesn't understand and says, well, inadvertently sent out, we always call these IDDs, indeterminate data disclosure, right? So they sent out information, maybe didn't understand how to do it, or the scope of the information was beyond what they were asked to share out. Hey, could you just send me a file of two employees' medical records? And then they end up sending, thousands, right? Or that type of, so, misuse and error, kind of that. And then I go, then you look at the fraudulent. So then what is those individuals been saying? Are they taking that activity and looking at it from, where can I make some financial gains from that process? Both breaking on policy, looking at, maybe it's time card, stuff, remote access where maybe they're not really working and they're doing two jobs. And then, intellectual property theft is the other piece, right? So those who are established employees for a long time, maybe leaving the organization, both voluntary and voluntarily, and they feel, hey, the data that I gathered while I was in this organization is mine, and they want to take it with them. So those are also those steps. And then IT sabotage. So those who, with the permissions to be able to do and have access to systems, also take those opportunities to either put in time bombs, sensitive breaks of cover up their tracks, right? Do these things, do things maliciously. Maybe they want to, maybe their disgruntled employee don't like their manager, or want to cover up, make it look like their manager's sending something, doing something on their behalf. So those are those sabotage aspects. So to me, those are the broad focus on how I look at all the areas in which I would consider insider threat.
Well, that's an excellent comprehensive definition. Nicole, anything you'd like to add or comment on what Brian's
I
described?
think Brian did a great job of really summarizing all of that. And I think what that really illustrates is it's multi-layered. There's so many different factors to consider, whether things are malicious, someone's trying to actively sabotage or actively try to steal intellectual data. And then there's the unintentional, they accidentally kind of left the digital back door open, unknowingly in most cases. But I think there's threat all around with that, and something that in our field we really do need to be cognizant of.
Nicole, is that sort of one of the main ways you bifurcate an incident at the beginning, and then you're going to go down one road or the other, determining if it's malicious or accidental?
So that is definitely one of the things that we think about. When I'm doing an investigation, I always look at intent. Did they intend to leave something available or steal information, or was it purely accidental? Their own lack of sophistication with IT systems. So that is definitely something that we always take into account.
Very good, Nick. Any thoughts on the definition of insider risk, or your comments from your co-panelists?
I agree with Nicole and Brian. The only thread I would pull on is that the way that I would think about the definition of insider threat or insider risk doesn't necessitate intent always, in that every employee, every workforce member poses risk. Any person who has access poses risk, and it may not always be malicious intent. Of course, there are those nefarious actors that are posed a significant risk to the organization. But as we've seen with so many of the large data breaches that occurred this year, insiders pose a risk because they are vectors for hackers to use to be able to get in, whether that's through weak access controls or phishing attacks. And so every employee to a degree is an insider risk. It's just making sure that there are layers of protection around that and controls that are in place.
All right, very good. Next question. What roles do the following departments have in mitigating insider risk, and how can these groups work together? So you have overall IT security, compliance and privacy, which I think sometimes are together, right, Nicole? Sometimes could they be separate, Nicole? Compliance and
I've seen
privacy?
organizations where they are separate, but there's always a very close working relationship between the two.
Right. So you have compliance and privacy, HR, which is a really big one to me in this, especially when we touch on the concept of letting, as Nick, as you mentioned, every employee is a vector, which means that you should be really careful with your hiring, right? So, you have to almost think about how you're introducing risk into the organization every time you hire someone. And then marketing, which can be leveraged for employee education. So people don't click on that link type thing, and messaging and boards and signs and screensavers and all these kind of things. But um, Nicole, we're going to start with you on this question. Talk about the different roles, and maybe some ways you've seen them work together well.
I think the first four, the biggest thing that they can do is start working on what the user access permissions look like. And also vetting when people need access to information. I mentioned when we were speaking earlier, there was a recent news article involving a pediatric health system in Texas, in a someone who was working as a resident gained access to patient information, had a political disagreement with the hospital's stance, and instead of turning it over to a whistleblower, even though they shouldn't have been accessing the information in the first place, it was not any of their patients, turned it over to a journalist. So of course, the first question I have is, why did this person who was not even affiliated with this hospital any longer, why were they given access to this information? So I think that really comes down to what is your policies, your procedures, and what level of access do you give those individuals based on their roles? Of course, according to HIPAA, you're supposed to only provide access based on someone's roles. It should be tailored. You don't want to give the entire workforce the same level of access. So that's really important for those four entities to work together on establishing those. And they should be reviewed on a regular cadence, not once because things change.
Very good, Brian.
So just looking at this list, I see two groups that are missing. I'd say legal and also physical security teams. So legal from a overall, matter of like addressing and make sure that, if we were to remove somebody for those, do we have a good backing so we don't have lawsuits associated with that? And another one, and I just kind of bring when I look at the physical security side, because a lot of when we think about the IT, assets, we still obviously, we have remote work, but we also have a lot of physical presence, and we have a level of trust that physical presence is taken care of. Without that, that also could be a situation where we have I'm going to give a little quick story. I was doing a security assessment for an organization and met with their head of physical security, and he said to me, he's like, Brian, he's like, our team and the security team, we're going to be on a side by side on a train track together, but we're never going to cross. And I said, well, let me share a situation. When I walked in the door, we came to your office, and I saw that there's a back door that was propped open, and that also in this location you have a network closet with network equipment and some servers. And I said, there's no locked door on that. So you literally have no protection. Anyone could walk in, and we potentially have a risk of compromise. Both, maybe they just start pulling wires, doing other aspects. We have no idea, or they pull and steal, laptops from, off desks. So those are things to me, I look and say that, that has to be that process as well. So, security team can only do as well as all the other teams collectively, right? So that's just an area I saw missing from the different groups.
Yeah, no, Brian, I mean, physical security, where physical meets cyber is a really, really interesting, probably for another webinar, which
Yeah.
I would like to do.
No,
But I
yeah.
think it's fascinating. I really do. And I think it's important, especially with some other things I'm hearing about ways people are trying to secure their cyber environments, where assumption that there are physical workstations, probably the ones that are in-house, there's an assumption that they're safer, right?
Right.
So, but you're saying, to your point, sometimes they're not, or at least they're not as safe as we think they are. So really interesting, but we'll put that sort of to the side for now, but really
Yeah.
interesting stuff. Nick,
But
go
I
ahead,
just kind
Brian.
of share from
Yeah,
also from an HR process, right? How do we make sure we're vetting out the employees,
yeah,
right? Are these individuals coming from, what was reasons why they left the other role? Are we doing a good job vetting, right? Because that's the piece. Are we bringing on employees with risk? So that's, building that process. And then, I've seen organizations that have strong controls around insider threat have a good balance with their IT security team and IT in general, just focus on that. And then within the privacy and compliance, really going through and hey, these double checks, building a cohesive working, relationship between teams and saying, what are we seeing here? What are we going from those aspects? And what will we do to enhance that level of protection? Whether, and as I noted, like the misuse and error, how do we bring in the commonalities of, we'll call it those mistakes and errors that we see that we can very easily bring to a continue training the employees so that we, mitigate some of that risk.
Excellent. Lots of great stuff in there. Nick, you've got the clients, so you've got you see a lot of different scenarios, a lot of different organizations. And what do you think are some common best practices here that you've seen, like in terms of these groups working together?
The theme that I always hear about and really believe in is the idea of partnership. Responsibilities like privacy versus security, or compliance versus IT, or human resources versus compliance. Those roles can work independently from each other, but they work so much better when they're accretive and supporting each other and building that partnership. I think the interesting one on this list is marketing, and that's a role that these on this list may not interact with each other all the time, but they're going to be interacting with each other when things get really bad. I think a great example of this is every privacy and security expert I've spoken to has commented on how well Ascension has handled external communication around their incident this year compared to Change Healthcare. I'd be curious from Nicole and Brian how much you both interact with marketing on a day-to-day basis compared to maybe going through exercise or preparations.
Nicole?
Sure. So we definitely work closely with marketing, especially if we're involved in some type of incident. Um, I don't think that relationship has always been that strong, though. But again, with the nature of the world as it is now, and unfortunately what we're seeing with all of these breaches, I think it's important for marketing to really understand what their role is in all of this and really be pulled more into working with us as part of the larger team. So I think this is a change for them, probably from what they're used to. They're used to just putting out great copy about all the wonderful things the organization does, but they're really they're a partner in all of this with us.
Brian, let me ask you a little bit about this partnering, the concept Nick talked about. How do you make it happen on the ground? I mean, you can't, I suppose you can't create it in an org chart, right? You can't org chart your way to partnerships. You have to have the incentive and the understanding of why this is important. And we're really talking about building human to human relationships. So is it as simple as calling someone up and saying, "Hey, how about we have a quarterly meeting, or how about we go out to lunch, or how about we get to know each other a little bit? I can tell you what we're doing. You can tell me what, you know, is that what we're talking about here when we talk about partnering?"
I think yes, that is one way. I think a lot of it is understanding how the two could complement each other. Some ways I've approached it in past is, having tabletop exercises, right? Running through these scenarios, walking through a situation where you have that, whether it's a breach and if it even if it loops inside, right? How is that process shared with the marketing communication teams? How do we leverage that? And then so once it's kind of establishing that and understanding where we have common roles that we could be sharing out, right? So to me, marketing also, I kind of align with also communications
Yeah,
process. So
yeah.
hey, here's the things, here's how we could also share, we're seeing these indicators, we're seeing these, things going on. Let's make sure we're driving that message, putting it, getting into their, how are they sending their campaigns about all the other items going on in the organization. Let's also like, could you help carve me out a spot where I'm going to talk about security issues or
Mm,
changes that we want to see, and building that and getting that. So like we always have a cadence. So that's the situation where I had a really good strong relationship with Marty. Is like, hey, we're doing our next monthly, newsletter or announcement. Brian, like they always carve me out a spot. What do we want to talk about. And that was a great way to make sure that I had a voice to share that message to the organization.
Yeah, and I think you touched on this, Nicole, the idea of perhaps educating PR/marketing a little bit about, hey, here are some things we can be doing together that would be helpful to us, to what we're trying to do over here, because they might not even realize it. As you said, sometimes it's just a tradition of putting out announcements about good news, but you say, no, you can play a really role. You can partner with us. We can use your help, and here's how. Here's some ideas, and then you start brainstorming, right?
Yep.
Right, correct. I started bringing them in, not necessarily related to insider threat, but potentially, but with social media investigations. That was, I think that really opened their eyes to what the type of work that we were doing and how they could be involved.
All right, excellent. Nick, we're gonna start with you on this. You talked about the Ascension breach. You mentioned that. Discuss how insider breaches can, and this is again the defense in depth thing. You often find there's a combination, almost a perfect storm of mistakes. Change Healthcare breach was an insider, so it was someone who had credentials, and they clicked on someone, fell victim to a phishing scam. But I'd also heard, and I don't know if this has been disproven, but I also heard there was no MFA on that particular account. So you've got multiple, you could call them failures or mistakes. So you could say, oh, if we did more employee education, maybe they wouldn't have clicked on that link. So we could do a little better there. And yeah, maybe there probably should have been MFA on that account. So different levels of mistakes. But you want to talk about that a little bit, that sort of concept of attacking things in that way?
Yeah, and this goes back to the point of why I think that all workforce members should be thought of some level of risk. These types of incidents are inevitable, and there's no perfect system. I mean, the only perfect system is one that's like unplugged, turned off, shut down, locked up, covered in concrete. And even then, I'm sure someone could still get in. And so there's no perfect system. So you have to assume things happen. And that's why I think building readiness is really important. Really understanding how to react is really important. But then the old adage of a layered security approach, I think, is also really important here. You can't just assume that because you have encryption, everything's fine, or if you have MFA, everything's fine. It's the comprehensiveness of the layers. Obviously, as a vendor in this space, we think of ourselves as the last layer, monitoring employee behaviors, ensuring that it's part of their job function. And while we don't specialize in external threats, we have detected various types of phishing attacks where employees' credentials have been compromised and suddenly their pattern deviates wildly from their clinical roles to something like downloading data or exfiltrating data or some type of a breach of disclosure. And so I think it's really important to think about all those layers. But the last thing I'll just comment on this is that just leaning back. So many of you know I'm a veteran. I was in the military and served in special operations where a lot of people asked, "Oh, did you do a lot of really like cool and exciting stuff?" And I'd have to say, honestly, special operations is about mastering the basics. And a lot of my training was, using very fundamental infantry skills that you would see elsewhere in the military. And I think that's really important when you think about compliance, privacy, and risk. It's not about finding the most sophisticated tool on the market. It is about mastering the basics. And so just reinforcing the idea that risk is everywhere, it's inevitable, having really solid layers, but then mastering those basics. And it's really unfortunate that some of the breaches we've heard about this year are when those basics are not in place, when there's not good controls at the foundation.
Brian, excellent. Thank you, Nick. Brian, you want to comment on that?
So I concur with a lot of what Nick was saying. It's always a balance of the layers of defense, right? Going through those, and I find I've worked in a security consulting where we came in post breach for organizations, and it's always the same common piece, right? It's all the same missteps. Fundamental controls just kind of broken. So going through, making sure everybody understands all those, and continue to adapt and make sure that we have the right adequate controls in place. I always look at, and then segmentation, right? Doing those pieces. So actually I could allude a little bit to Nick's, my first, I guess if you want to look at my first job, I was actually in the military doing as military intelligence. So supporting a focus on interrogation of POWs, right? When you look at that, so it's like, what do? We always try to interrogate, get that information. And the military always had a good way of segmenting, need to know basis, who has that, because that risk of exposure. So I always look that same foundation and like bring it to the corporate side. Okay, let's talk about that. Let's think about those layered defenses, segmentation. What are those rights so that we minimize if something was gone and we compromise, we minimize that level of impact, right? And trying to do that. And that's kind of that same process. So looking at, what I always look at is like take a holistic look at your risk areas, focus on what kind of controls you have in place, kind of do some of that threat modeling, and then determine the appropriate changes that you need to make to build those levels of controls. So it's not always, everybody tries to throw technology at everything too, but it's also people and process, building that as well.
Well, we certainly do have an interesting panel today. Special ops, military intelligence, and Nicole also
I am.
currently in the Air Force, right?
Yeah, I'm an Air Force reservist. I'm a medical officer currently serving as a medical planner focused on the Pacific region. So.
Awesome. Oh, it's great panel. Nicole, anything you want to add regarding the question on the screen?
I love the fact that we're bringing this military, very structured background into this and how we approach compliance, privacy, security in this. And Brian kind of touched on something that I don't think we spend enough time on in healthcare, and maybe don't have the mature process yet, but we talk about it a lot as far as the military goes, and that is knowing your people. And what I mean by that is really not monitoring them very closely, but just start watching for weird behavior. There's been a number of incidences that have unfortunately affected the military where intelligence has been released, I think over the last 20 years, and for various reasons. And I think it comes from, of course, following processes, procedures, or standards, but also watching for when your soldiers, your staff members in this case, start exhibiting some worrying behaviors. Maybe they've had a change in political ideology, or start having some, in our case, some sympathy with some of our opposing forces. And so, but I don't think, again, in healthcare, we really have started thinking about that. I think we tend to think of our workforce, we're the good guys. We are here because we love what we do and support patient care. But sometimes it's not always that simple. And sometimes people aren't always in the job for the right reasons. And maybe they started out with the right reasons and things have happened along the way.
Well, Nick, let's bring you in here with that kind of concept. Is this something that the Protenus software helps, is detect these sort of anomalous behaviors in an automated fashion?
Absolutely. Again, we like to think of ourselves as that last layer of defense monitoring operations, but I think I'll call out the concept that while there are nefarious actors that have really malicious intent, oftentimes our healthcare employees are overworked, under-resourced, under a lot of burden, a lot of stress. And the fact that they have so much access lends them, maybe a little bit of a slip down a bad direction that can, when left unchecked, can build up behavior over time. One of the most interesting things we found in our research was that while our customers had our analytics tuned to the most nefarious behaviors, they often were, I don't know if ignoring is the right word, but not focusing on the lower risk incidents. And the reason for that is because they just didn't have time to handle the capacity of the larger volume of low risk incidents. However, we looked into those cases and found that the people who are the most egregious in their behaviors they don't start that way. They build up those behaviors over time. And so thinking about a monitoring program that provides opportunities for on-the-spot correction, personalized remediation early in that process when someone is maybe starting to slip can be so beneficial. Sometimes it's as easy as reaching out to a workforce member and just saying, "Hey, we noticed you do this," a reminder that's against our policy. You're not supposed to do that. And 99% of the time, it's met with some type of positive constructive output. In fact, we published a study where we found that an email notice for a low risk incident, first time offense, actually has a 2% chance to turn into something more nefarious or equally in terms of violations. But not sending an email has a 70% chance to go down that path of increasing severity of risk. And so thinking about the full spectrum and just reminding ourselves that not everyone is really malicious. Sometimes these risks turn out to be benevolence. It's just an employee trying to help a family member or a coworker. We often hear about, oh, I just heard their birthday was coming up and I wanted to know which day of the week it was so I could tell them on the right day. And so I opened their medical record, and that's wrong. But it's a great opportunity to remind and educate the workforce instead of coming at it more intensively.
Excellent, Brian. You want to jump in there?
Yeah, so I liked a little bit what Nick was saying, that I think it's that overwork piece, right? But I always like assume good intent. That's a big piece, right? Because a lot of it is not, you know, in most of the situation I've seen, it very thankfully is a infrequent when it's really truly malicious intent versus that, hey, I sent this information. I know it was wrong, but I had to do it. I thought it was, aligned with, supporting the patient or patient safety. And we're going through those. And so then that's just that I look at those are more of those teachable moments, right? How do we bring in, how do we educate doing that? But I think also, it's looking at those, making sure that there's a positive culture in the organization to share when we see some of those, what are those outwardly signs when somebody does go from good to bad, right? So there are limited, thankfully it's limited, but there are some cases when we see that where somebody is going through, like, they might have some hard times, or they're, the organization is going through some structural change and they're not taking it well, and that's those things. And so let's is there an opportunity to share that they're not going to be judged, and bring that up and have those, because I think sometimes I've also seen that, like, those cases where you'll see policy violations going on, or they're doing that and then it turns into like that, actual malicious behavior where some of those things turn into, hey, well, you know what, I'm going to leave this organization. I'm taking my data with me, and I'm going to try to find any way possible. And could some of those other indicators actually have been a trigger? But we just oversaw it because we thought also that good intent and didn't see those bad signs. So making sure there's a good mechanism of knowing those bad indicators versus the benign ones that are just mistakes and misuse errors that we see.
Excellent. Very good. All right. This is sort of the core to what we want to talk about today, and really interesting to me. What are the main reasons there can be fluctuations in insider risk levels, sort of at a high level in a big way? If we had a high level dashboard showing risk by color, and again, insider risk, what can we cause it to temporarily turn red, and how can these be mitigated? And some of the ways this could happen might be large hiring or layoff initiatives, major fluctuations in permissions, such as around COVID, where people are getting a ton of different new permissions. There has to be a process for those to be rolled off, right? When they don't need those permissions anymore, sometimes they just get added and added and added. And then M&A. You pick up one, two, three hospitals, you've taken on thousands of employees in a day, so to speak. And if every employee is a risk vector, that's quite a bit of new risk. And especially if you think you have a very good hiring process where you've got a very tight hiring process, you've just taken on three new hospitals. You don't know if that same level of scrutiny was being taken over there. So a lot of things here. Um, but Nicole, I'm gonna start with you. What are your thoughts around some of these big things?
So M&A is definitely something that is always a concern for me. was involved in acquiring a large practice in a previous role. And of course, day one, they're not going to be on all of your systems. That would be lovely if they were, but you're going to be segmented for probably a period of time. And so there's this worry and of course a risk with, you don't know their systems, you don't have the same level of controls over them like you do your own internal systems. And then there's also the onboarding process, making sure that they have the same level of awareness, the same level of education, but you're also trying to balance that with they're trying to get things up and running and start having the same level of performance like all our current areas. So it's really a balancing act, but I think there's a very large amount of risk. And that's also where you do your due diligence at working in IT compliance, privacy. You're evaluating, because to Nick's point, anytime you bring on a new or an existing practice, there's always a level of risk, and we accept that, but understanding is an acceptable level of risk.
Excellent, Brian.
So I definitely see, from a merger and acquisition process, what risks are we inheriting? So having a good follow-up and actually an assessment, making sure that's part of a program process. A lot of times I don't see that happening holistically, at least in healthcare space. Have we done a full cyber risk assessment of that organization before we bring them on, or so we could address that? But when I look at here too, the large hiring and layoff initiatives, those from an insider threat perspective, that's when that's what I'm talking about, those indicators that go from the good to, good to bad. I've seen it problematic sometimes in that layoff initiative, right? Hey, there's some of this stuff, and that's where people feel like the organization let them down. And then when that happens, those are the things where that's where the lack of caring and the, not less concerned of those. And so if you have an individual who's disgruntled or not in alignment, that becomes a risk, right? And I've seen situations where that is like that's occurred where maybe they see that they might have been phished, but they're not reporting it. They're not concerned. It's not my problem. So this is a company's problem. Let them solve it. And I've literally seen a case where somebody was just knew that things were changing in the organization. They were seeing problems with their computer. They just said, you know what, I'm not even bothering. I'm just shutting off my screen, and they shut off their screen. Didn't realize they had ransomware on the computer, and the entire system was locked out. And then nobody could come in, and even the Monday morning, they had to break down doors because the physical controls were all broken. Everything. So when you look back, that was big. So that like that disgruntled employee, right? So look at all those things that change that, and it could be both on the hiring too. Hey, why am I being replaced? I should be moved up. I should do that. So have a really good understanding of how that impacts the employee psyche is a good way as an indicator to help reducing that insider risk.
It's some really great points there, Brian. Things I hadn't even thought about someone being passed over for a promotion. Um, it's really, really interesting. So I guess it's tough to automate some of that stuff, Nick. Some of that gets really nuanced and complicated. Some of that may just be um, communication between the departments to inform IT what's going on. So we're bringing on a new person, and I don't even know if conversations like that happen, Brian. Where it's so we're bringing on hey IT, we're bringing on a new individual. By the way, Jim thought he was going to get this job, and he's not getting it, and he's not happy. So you might want to keep an eye on him. I mean, do things get to that level of communication and nuance?
So I've had certain situations like that brought to my attention because they were there and saying, what could we do to review that information about that individual? Or sometimes that we want to make sure that we're going to be making a change here and removing an individual. It's also, I'm not sure if that person, we try to keep it confidential, but sometimes information leaks out, somebody thinks that they're not sharing it, there's somebody sharing to somebody else in confidence, and it kind of goes out and tips off that person. So could we have these indicators? What can we do to monitor that user's activity and make sure that they're not going to be disruptive, right? They're not going to be doing that. So that happens. And when I help organizations kind of look at an insider threat program, it's, how do we build that process that says, let's take this information. There could be valid pieces that says, let's build these as additional indicators for like awareness. So if I see a trigger type event with that other aspect, it gives a higher level of scrutiny versus being dismissed as benign.
Nick, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
We have a lot of conversations with our customers about ways of incorporating these insights into our analytics. And one of the most interesting we hear about is the fact that a lot of health systems, the only thing you can do after an incident, the only remediation is termination. And so unfortunately, that person goes back out to the workforce and they get hired by someone else. And then there's a level of risk that exists with a new hire that is unbeknownst to the new employer. And so we've been asked, can those kind of insights be passed from one site to another? And obviously we use client unique key encryption. So there's no way, not even talking about like the HR levels of restrictions there about employment bias. But what I always remind our customers is that our analytics are focused at finding them to ensure the person is doing what part of treatment and payment operations require them to get the work done. And that it's never one thing that triggers an incident or an investigation. It's a combination of multiple things. And we saw during the pandemic and the post-pandemic years, high volume of turnover in our customers, as you've listed out here, and a high number of temporary staff or contract staff. And in that, we started to see a frequency of violations occur very early in an employee's tenure, down to as little as I think within 2 weeks, 16 days or so, that an incident would be detected. And what's really interesting, because we work very closely with our customers on cases. We're always trying to listen into our customers about incidents and fine tune our analytics and see if there's any configurations that we can change. And we bring our customers together in regional round groups and we have conversations about war stories. But we started picking up on these cases where our account managers were noticing the names of cases of individuals from other customer sites because of the uniqueness of their names. And we realized that we were catching these incidents that were, they were at one employer, they were committing some type of violation, they were terminated, hired somewhere else, and caught again. And I think that goes back to the idea of having a really robust layered approach and the increasing your likelihood of catching something, even if you don't know all of the facts of the matter or their past employment history or all the warning signs. If you have those good measures in place, you should be catching that risk on a routine basis.
All right, very good. Got a couple audience questions I want to bring in here. How do you balance the need to ensure that you're not hiring a major security risk with the need to attract good employees who may not be interested in really intensive background checks or checks that don't seem in alignment with their type of role? So that's a very interesting point. That goes into the whole workforce shortage thing, hard to get good people, hard to keep good people, um, and the fear that you're going to scare off somebody who's qualified and might be good for the organization because you want to put them through the washing machine or whatever expression you want to give a deep dive into their background, and they might say, you know what, this is a little too intimate for me. Take care. Nicole, let's throw you into this one. What do you think?
So I actually just went through that process of it was very interesting being in that, especially when you're talking about different industries, coming from Department of Defense background and not really understanding that world and the documentation that comes in. I think with everything and what I always tell everyone is set the expectation and give the why. I think when we're hiring people, explain to them why we're doing this, why we're doing this background check. And it's not that we're suspicious of them. but we need to protect the organization and also, of course, protect the patient. We want to protect their information. It's not that, again, we don't trust them, but we need to make sure that we are bringing on trustworthy individuals. I think with everything, it's setting those expectations and explaining to them why, not just, well, we make everyone go through this and we want everything in triplicate and also, 3 vials of your blood. So.
That's a great point. The why is a big thing because they may not realize it. Again, back to the point Nick made about everyone being a vector. Depending on how you've got your network architected and your defense in depth and all that, um, we don't want to say that every click can bring down the organization, but
Right.
explaining to them that a lot of these ransomware incidents are by an employee who clicked on the wrong thing, and that's why we need to be really careful about who we bring in here. So that's why we're doing some extensive, as you said, communication can be a big part of that. Um, Brian, any more on the thoughts of the connection between IT security and HR? And any communication there where you want to make sure HR, like you want certain things included in the hiring process, or you want certain things communicated, or certain expectations communicated in the hiring process to sort of tighten that filter, things that HR may not even realize you're concerned about.
Yeah, no, so some of it, so the background checks obviously is a part of that piece, but some, like we were just talking, what Nick brought up, hey, an individual could have been let go in another organization, and unless there was probably a criminal investigation or not, it may be gone unknown to the next hiring organization, right? So it goes back really goes back to how well are you defining your steps in the interviewing process. So I've been pretty structured, and I worked with some of my HR teams about here. Even all my teams are like, here's the type of things we're gonna like look to approach and look at and analyze that. Make sure we have specific examples where we're calling out, because that's the only way when in that interviewing process to really flesh out the competency of a person. If there's any associated risk, that should be part of it. Then from an IT perspective, I worked at my security consulting side. We had our slogan on the organization was "Trust no one." So that was so. At the end of the day, if we bring in more of this the zero trust environment, that's the whole idea, right? Is like looking at those indicators, making sure that we go through that process and assume everyone, everyone is a risk and just segment their role.
Excellent. Nick, any thoughts?
I have seen an increasing trend around continuous background checks in the industry, where instead of just getting new employee background checks, you're getting subscription for your workforce and constantly monitoring. I've seen a lot of trends towards anti-doxing for leadership too, like those software that look for your leaders that might be more vulnerable to spear phishing,
Hmm.
and seeing where their social media might be creating penetration risk for your organization and tying those together. So I think there's what Brian's talking about, zero trust, I think is increasing as the risk increase, especially with more remote workforce. The number of vulnerabilities I think are going up. But I think Nicole really hit the nail on the head when it came to explaining why you're looking into these things for workforce, and the need for culture fit to be assessed during the hiring process. It's not just about skills and expertise, but we really invest heavily in our hiring process around, is there a culture fit towards a bias for privacy, security, and compliance, because that's what we do as a company. And we're not the average Silicon Valley focused AI company that just wants to build fast and break things. We want to actually, help our customers build a really robust risk management platform. And so that takes a lot more thoughtfulness in our approach, and a lot more collaboration with our customers when it comes to these compliance, privacy, and security needs. So in building that into the beginning of your relationship between the employee and the employer, I think is really important.
All right, very good. Nicole, I'm going to put this in front of you because it's an audience question, although I'm not sure you're going to be able to answer it. Do you have any recommendations for getting around HR practices that say we won't give out firing reasons when people call us and therefore they won't discuss firing for security reasons? How do you get around that, Nicole?
Wow. I mean, I think it depends, of course, what state you're in, and of course, labor laws, what you're legally allowed to give out. Honestly, if I ever received any of those types of questions or anything like that, I'm going to defer to HR and legal about what's. I think most organizations, they're allowed to give. Yes, the person worked here and their dates, and that's usually the. I don't want to put my organization at risk for a lawsuit. So
Yeah, yeah. All right, very good. I think what we're going to do here is we're going to go for a round of final thoughts and best piece of advice. We'll go with, I usually frame this up. We'll start with you, Brian. Best piece of advice around insider risk for someone in your role at a comparable sized health system. So you somewhere else without all your experience.
So I think what you need to look at, I'd go back to understanding the type of insider risk that you have, assess where that biggest risk might be in your organization, what current capabilities you have in place to mitigate that risk or manage it, and then help prioritize on where you could address the items that are still noted as high risk within your organization.
Yeah, sort of very logical, sequential, military type approach, right, Nick? Get the basics right. Do really good at the basic stuff. Nicole, your final thought.
in addition to what Brian said, and Nick touched on it earlier, but don't discount those good catches or the low level events. Those are your opportunities to review processes or do additional education with staff. Those are your thermometer to start seeing when issues are starting to rise, and putting some things in place to address them early on before they become a major incident. So that would be my recommendation.
That's great. Another excellent one. Nick, we're going to give you the final word here.
What an honor. I'll double tap the idea of relationships. I say this a lot, but you don't want to be meeting a colleague for the first time in a critical environment, and having an existing relationship where you've met them and understand their roles and responsibility and what motivates them and how best to work with them, I think is so important. Just to be ready for when things get heated. It's better to have that existing relationship than starting from scratch.
That makes a lot of sense. There's a tremendous amount of good stuff today. Very practical points that I think people can adopt. You can create a nice list if you were listening today of ways to improve. So, excellent, excellent conversation regarding continuing education. You could use the final slide in this deck. You'll get an email when the on-demand recording of this event is ready for viewing. If you want to work with us, you can reach out to Nancy Wilcox from our team and go to our website to register for upcoming panels. With that, I want to thank our tremendous panel, Brian Kayer, Nicole Brown, and Nick Culbertson, and Protenus for sponsoring and making the event possible, and you for attending. And with that, everybody have a wonderful day. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Cool.